Hi, everyone. I am David Lipton, creator of the podcast series The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. I am introducing an experimental series of AI generated conversations, complements of Notebook LM. These conversations are based entirely on my podcasts. They are called the Deep Dive series. Just imagine two of your friends discussing my podcasts and enjoy the conversations.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that never seems to go away. Who's to blame for all this government overspending in America? And get this, our source material is a podcast episode from the future.
From 2030 to be precise. Apparently, hindsight is 2020. Because this guy, David Lipton, claims he knows exactly who's responsible for out-of-control spending.
Okay, dramatic much. So who's the culprit in this future history lesson?
Well, Lipton points the finger squarely at us, the American people.
Wait, seriously, he's blaming us, the people, not the politicians making the budgets.
He goes deep on this. He starts way back in the 19th century, pointing to how consistently divided the U.S. has been between the two major parties. Almost like clockwork, it's been neck and neck for over a century.
Okay, that's true. We rarely see a landslide victory for one party or the other, but how does that equal we're to blame for overspending?
That's where Lipton gets really interesting. He says it's not just about who gets more votes. It's about what those votes represent. Two fundamentally different visions of what the government should be doing.
So it's like we're choosing between two different paths, and both lead to overspending.
Exactly. Lipton says Democrats lean towards government regulation, using it as a tool to create a fairer society and address things like poverty or health care. Republicans, he says, are more skeptical of government intervention, believing it often gets in the way of individual freedom and economic growth.
Okay, that tracks with what we usually hear, but I'm still not seeing the connection to out-of-control spending.
Lipton argues that regardless of who's in office, this fundamental tension between more government or less government plays out in the budget. He points to the explosion in social spending since the 1970s. Think Social Security, Medicare, welfare programs. They all saw massive growth.
And he's saying both parties contributed to this, even with their different philosophies.
That's his point. He even uses a chart showing how much the government spends compared to the entire U.S. economy. It's called Federal Outlays as a Percentage of GDP. And let me tell you, that line starts shooting upwards in the 1970s. His argument is that whether we're voting for more government programs or tax cuts that require more borrowing, both have contributed to the national debt.
So no matter who we vote for, we're essentially voting for more spending one way or another. That's kind of a bleak picture.
It gets even more interesting. Lipton doesn't just point fingers at political parties. He calls out his own generation.
The baby boomers.
Oh boy, here we go. I knew we couldn't have this conversation without mentioning the boomers.
Lipton argues that boomers basically embraced a level of government spending they knew they couldn't actually pay for. They wanted it all robust social programs and lower taxes and kind of passed the buck down the line.
And now we're stuck with the bill. So what does Lipton propose we do about it? He can't just drop this bombshell from the future and leave us hanging, right? Well, he doesn't offer any magic solutions. But he does suggest a pretty radical shift in perspective. He says before we go pointing fingers at politicians, we need to take a good hard look in the mirror.
Ouch. So it's all our fault.
He doesn't frame it quite that harshly, but he does say we need to acknowledge our own complicity in this system. Both sides want something for nothing. He says we can't keep demanding lower taxes while also expecting the government to fix everything.
He's saying we can't have our cake and eat it too. That's like economics 101.
Sure, but we don't always like to hear it.
Yeah.
Especially from our elected officials. Lipton's point is that we, the voters, we need to be more aware of these trade-offs. Do we want lower taxes even if it means cutting back on social programs? Are we willing to pay more in taxes if it means a stronger safety net for those who need it?
He's challenging us to be more honest about what we want and what we're willing to sacrifice for it.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond this mentality of what's in it for me and thinking more about the collective good and the long-term consequences of our choices.
But how do we even begin to change that mindset? It seems like Lipton's arguing that this desire for more government help, regardless of the cost, is deeply ingrained in American culture.
He does make that point, and it's a really interesting one. He points to how both Democrats and Republicans, despite their different views on government, have contributed to this pattern of increased spending. It's almost like we're addicted to the idea of the government providing for us, even if it means going deeper into debt.
Okay, the addiction metaphor is a bit dramatic. But I see what he's getting at. It's easier to demand more from the government than it is to make sacrifices ourselves.
And Lipton argues that until we confront that uncomfortable truth, we're unlikely to break this cycle of overspending.
It's like he's saying, hey, I'm from the future, and spoiler alert, this approach isn't sustainable.
Right. And he's challenging us to learn from his generation's mistakes.
So what does Lipton suggest we do? He can't just leave us with a lecture on fiscal responsibility and a one-way ticket to doom. There's got to be some hope here, right?
Lipton argues that recognizing the problem is the first step. He says we need to move beyond partisan finger-pointing and start having more honest conversations about our expectations of government and the trade-offs we're willing to make as a society.
Okay, that's fair. We can't just wish away the national debt, but honestly, these conversations about government and spending, they always feel so big and complicated. Where do we even start?
Lipton would say we start by understanding those two different visions of government we talked about, the regulation camp versus the limited government camp. He suggests that until we acknowledge that these two perspectives exist and that both hold valid points, it's tough to have productive conversations about spending.
It's like we're always talking past each other. One person's vital safety net is another person's government overreach.
Right. And those deeply held beliefs influence how we think about every single item in the budget. For example, if you believe the government should play a major role in providing health care, you're probably more likely to support programs like Medicare for All, even if it means higher taxes.
But if you think healthcare is primarily an individual responsibility, then those programs probably feel like a waste of money, or even an infringement on your freedom to choose.
Exactly. And Lipton challenges us to look beyond those surface-level disagreements and understand the underlying values driving those different perspectives. It's not enough to say, I want lower taxes or I want better health care.
We have to ask ourselves, what am I willing to give up to get that? Are we willing to pay a little more in taxes for better schools or roads? Are we okay with cutting back on certain programs to reduce the national debt?
It's about acknowledging that there are always trade-offs, and we can't have it all. And maybe, just maybe, by understanding where the other side is coming from, we could start to find some common ground and make more informed choices about our collective future.
So it's not just about crunching numbers and balancing the budget. It's about having these bigger conversations about our values and what we want our society to look like.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and that the choices we make today will have a profound impact on future generations. Lipton's message from 2030 isn't meant to scare us. It's meant to empower us.
He's basically saying, hey, I've seen how this movie ends, and you've still got time to write a different ending.
And that's a powerful message. We have the ability, and more importantly, the responsibility to be more engaged, informed citizens. We need to hold our elected officials accountable, yes, but we also need to hold ourselves accountable for the choices we make, both at the ballot box and in our everyday lives.
So what's the takeaway here? Are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of past generations? Or can we actually break the cycle of overspending and create a more sustainable future?
Lipton doesn't offer any easy answers, but his insights give us a lot to think about. He reminds us that change starts with each and every one of us. It starts with asking tough questions, being willing to listen and learn from those who hold different views, and having those honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about what really matters. Because ultimately, the future of our nation depends not on the decisions of politicians, but on the choices we make together as a society.
Wow, that's a pretty profound thought to end on. This deep dive definitely left me with a lot to ponder. Thanks for breaking it all down with me.
Anytime. These are conversations that deserve our full attention.